I think this is the first part of our video. The second part will be in the afternoon. And I think this video is a very good introduction to our keynote speakers. We have a keynote speaker, Oana Simionescu from Timișoara, and Mrs. Lydia Pieszka. Sorry if from Poznan. Oana Simionescu is going to talk to us about housing policies in Romania and in Timișoara. She is an architect and a manager. She teaches at the Faculty of Architecture from Timișoara, and she is involved in several NGOs in Timișoara. She also is coordinator of the annual and then the Timișoara Architecture Biennial. She is the founder and coordinator of the Collaboration Platform 4. She is member of the National Romanian Order of Architects, and she is member of the Financial Committee and representative of Romania on housing issues in the Architecture Council of Europe. I welcome her, and we are very glad to see her with us, and she has a very interesting presentation. Please, Oana, take the floor.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the very kind introduction and for the opportunity to be here among you. I congratulate you for this meeting and for this program, and I really hope that everything that you set yourselves to do on this matter of solving the housing problem is successful. You have a really difficult task ahead, and I'm really happy to be able to contribute even a little. I will share with you my screen now. In order to show you my presentation. Is everything okay? Do you see my screen? Yes, good.
Oana, sorry. Yes, we see your screen and everything is fine. I just want to inform our Polish URLG members, if they are here and available, that there is Polish interpretation for your speech as well. So if anyone would like to hear this in Polish, you can go to the menu below, see the interpretation and hear that in Polish. Thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
Can I?
Yes, Dubrovna.
Tak, Liat, can I say a few words in Polish? Jeżeli ktoś z Państwa po polsku, na dole jest ikonka, może Michał potem doda, należy po prostu przyłączyć na język polski. To jest taki globus. Na dole jest reaction i obok należy zmienić to na Polish. I wtedy będziemy słyszeć po prostu po polsku, tak? Tak. No. Gdyby ktoś z Państwa miał problem, to proszę na czacie. Thank you, Liat.
Thank you all. Go ahead, Jan. Sorry.
Okay, so I structured my presentation into 5 chapters. First, we're going to look at the urban housing stock in Romania. Then we're going to talk a little about the right and need for housing, about housing as a project, about housing affordability, and of course, at the end, we will briefly look at the future. So I will start with urban housing stock in Romania. Despite a seemingly wide range of different offers of new residential developments on the free market, most of us live in 2 or 3 room apartments. In order to understand the current state of collective housing and be able to debate their future, a thorough and multi-angle analysis of the evolution of the build stock is required. Obviously, Romania's build stock of urban housing has been hugely influenced by the urban boom during communism, to which we owe more than 2/3 of today's housing. The old stock is still a major landmark. A strong interest in building new residential developments is shown only in few magnet cities, where the urban population of the country is concentrated. From among the 320 towns, the 279 with a population under 50,000 are shunned by investors and analysts in general. 2/3 of Romanians' urban housing were built in the 60s, as I said before. You can see this here in the graph. And after 90s, over a similar period of time of 30 years, and despite the recent housing boom, 4 times less dwellings have been built if compared to those built between the Second World War and the 60s. In 92, the majority of housing development left unfinished at the end of the communist period are completed. At that time, most of them consisted of 2 rooms and 3 rooms apartment, while those of 4 and 5 rooms were almost absent. However, after 92, a wide range of housing types emerges and the 3 rooms apartment become very popular. We can see that in 2016, 72% of Romania's population lives in housing blocks, as compared to the European average of 39%. Over 4 million people live today in urban blocks in this type of distribution. Very few of them live in bigger flats, while the overwhelming majority of the population lives in really small apartments. The right and need for housing. In Romania, there is still a great need for housing, which the new building blocks fail to cover. Such a need has been generated by wildly different dynamics depending on inhabitants' social and economic status. The latter varies from the worst case of total absence of a roof to the ultra-congestion of the existing dwellings or the poor quality. After the 90s, the state has dramatically shrunk its responsibilities on the field of housing. The right to housing is stipulated in the legislation of human rights, which Romania has endorsed through 6 major international treaties. Nonetheless, the right to housing is not explicitly formulated in the 91 Constitution, which is being quite long-windedly included in Article 43, the standard of living, which stipulates that it is mandatory that the state take measures concerning economic development and social protection so as to ensure its citizens a decent standard of living. However, after the 90s, people are loaded almost exclusively with the responsibility on housing quality. The massive privatization of the housing stock after 89 symbolically acknowledged the right of owning property, yet it was understood as a means through which state responsibility in the domain of housing ceased to exist. And what you can see here in the graph is a really abrupt switch of property. In the 90s, the state owned almost 60% of the housing stock, while now it only owns 1.8% of the housing stock and 98% of the stock is privately owned. In 2011, there were around 120 dwellings owned by local authorities, most of them in the urban environment. In 2015, almost a quarter of them, 29,000, were social housing. Very few of the social housing owned by local authorities are vacant and can be rented to new supplicants. At the time, according to the same inquiry, the number of applications for social housing owned by local authorities went beyond 67,000, yet it is more likely that these figures are below the actual need. The case of homelessness is poorly documented in statistic records. The few significant inquiries have been carried out on rather small samples of localities, and older studies are based on local authorities' estimates that have not been proven valid yet. Thus, we may rightly say that there is no reliable estimate on the extent of this phenomenon nationwide. At this point, we know that we have about 15,000 homeless people in Romania. On average, in Romania, there are larger households than in all other parts of Europe, being concentrated in less spacious housing units, which leads to overcrowding. 49.5% of the urban population lives in overcrowded housing units, while 8.4% of the population lives in poor condition. Compared to the European median average, only 17.6% of the European population lives in overcrowded flats, and only 5.1% in precarious conditions. Although a significant increase of square meters for all types of apartments has been signaled, a person living in the urban environment in Romania benefits on average of 18.47 square meters, which is half as much as the European average documented in 2016. The areas per person are generally smaller in Romania than the European averages. The most affected apartments are those inhabited by the majority of the populations, the 1, 2, and 3 rooms apartments. Hence, despite the statistical increase in living areas, most people have not perceived this change. Beside overcrowding, other aspects of poor living standards, such as the absence of bathroom, toilet, poorly insulated roof, or insufficient natural light, affect Romanians' housing. The inequalities between rural and urban zones are but obvious. Such flaws are known as severe housing deprivation rate. Housing as a project. In the 50s, there was a strong will to create a new socialistic rhetoric. And in the virtue of industrialization and rapid urban growth, there was a push to build as fast and as judicious as possible. Despite the fact that collective housing was highly criticized as the beginning of the decade, once the construction costs were evaluated, a major shift from building single housing units to collective housing happens. This is also one of the reasons why the entire logic of the way land was divided, owned, and used in the city also shifts. From the urban planning point of view, the 50s were characterized by the control of the state in this matter, even though most of the investment in housing was still private at this point. Starting with 49, the entire design process becomes centralized and subjected to maximal economical efficiency principles, while respecting territorial systematization plans imposed by the centralized planning institutes. This is when standardized apartments started to become the norm. Territorial systematizations become mandatory, bringing forward the Russian model of the socialist city and trying to eradicate the differences between center and suburb, village and city. One of the main tasks of these schemes was to deliver territorial zoning rules and to connect residential development with other socio-economical functionalities. From an urban point of view, street-aligned urban blocks, locally known as kvartal, which is Russian for neighborhood, are typically for this period. They are urban ensembles formed by low-height housing blocks that develop around one or more courtyards. The architectural aesthetics focuses on durable monumentality, despite the low height of the buildings, usually using national symbols, symmetry, ornamentation, and good quality materials. The architectural ensembles were usually well inserted in their context with a pleasant atmosphere. The high requests for housing at this time determined that the buildings erected in these decades are mostly composed of two-room apartments. About 70 to 75 of the total number of apartments in the block are usually two-room apartments. The same reasoning determined that all rooms were considered to be also bedrooms, and this happened up until 57. And quite often such apartments are seen as suitable to be inhabited by 5 family members. Some apartments even suggest the common use of kitchen, bathroom, and storage by 2 families. In the 56, the idea of half a room appears, which is added as an additional functional unit to one of the sleeping rooms. In these times, in order to be able to move to the city, one had to provide a certificate issued by the authorities responsible with housing that proved that the persona had a home, which was usually provided by the state or by the company that employed the person or by the family that already lived in the city. As a case study for Timișoara, we are looking at Heinrich Heine ensemble, which was built in 54 by the Sovron Constructs for its employees on a plot of land at the margins of the central district of Cetate, which was free in the mid-50s. It was thought of as an enclosure with low height sections with an interior courtyard designed to stimulate community life. Only half of the complex is built in the 50s. Many of the inhabitants of these blocks are generally the first occupants or their families. The sale and rental rates of apartments are now higher compared to other apartments in the area, but this is especially its very central location. In the 60s, the quartal is replaced with the microrayon as an urban planning unit, which is more elastic in relation with the city, easier to adapt to natural condition, and well correlated with industrial production standards. Despite the abrupt growth of industrialization and by consequence housing need, the 6-year achievement plan foresees an end to the shortage of housing, possibly due to the new urban housing unit. Housing development is also seen as an opportunity to give cities a new socialist form and thus erase urban structures that organize society in a different manner before. The microrayon was the planning typology used until the end of the decade and covered huge areas of socialist cities, sometimes housing tens of thousands of inhabitants, as multiple units of 8,000 to 12,000 inhabitants were connected. The benefit brought by this urban system was in the complementary facilities that they contain, because they also contain schools, kindergarten, stores, clubs, and so forth. After 65, the construction of housing became extremely prolific and is based on a series of plans, policies, and laws that were generated in these decades. New typologies of buildings were imposed, minimal surface area for housing units, categories of comfort, a standard level of equipment, but also a capped pricing level for the apartment. And as a consequence, sometimes even for some of the materials that were used to build the apartments with. Also, families were not allowed to own more than one flat and a country house. The production of housing becomes as industrialized as possible, and investment in housing is done mainly by the state. In order to cover the housing need and to mobilize the economies of the population, a legal framework for private investment is also generated. The industrialization and standardization of production of housing, combined with the demolition process and urban loss of landmarks, generated relatively uniform and anonymous urban fabrics around the country. From an architectural point of view, the buildings become less ornated, less monumental, and embrace the language of modernism. Due to the high priority of the economic efficiency of the production of housing, after the first half of the decade, architectural quality became less and less important, and many compromises were made on the quality of the state-developed housing. From a technical point of view, thermal and sound insulation and also quality of materials had to suffer, to the internal organization of space, or even standardization of the building heights. Most of them have 5 or 9 to 11 floors, and only a few exceptions were of building which were higher than 13 buildings. For Timișoara, we chose the Tipografilor ensemble, which was developed on the free lands along the Interval Villa district, in close connection with the printing house, which also gave the name of the current Ionescu Boulevard. The ensemble is characterized by simple prismatic volumes, located remarkably remote from each other, buildings that float in a green space. The ensemble is free from transit traffic, being a space mainly used by residents and visitors, with a perception of safe passage and living in the neighborhood. Many of the residents have been living here since its construction, and they know their neighbors well. Newcomers appreciate it's a very good place to live. What you can see here is actually an extract from studies done inside the architectural institutes. Here you can see the 4 levels of comfort for a 2 rooms flat. And here you can see studies that were made inside the Architectural Institute that were looking at how space needed to be organized, considering the activity of family with different numbers of members. And these kinds of studies were used in order to generate the legislation in Romania regarding the minimal surfaces of the buildings, but also regarding the way in which the state used to allocate buildings of apartments of different sizes to different sized families. In the 70s, in the general context of solving a consistent part of the housing need, the 70s focused on better quality. In the first article of Law 4 in 73 regarding the development and sale of housing by the state, it is stated, the high development of national economy the modernization of cities and worker centers, the growing number of workers and specialized staff, the continuous growth of salaries and other income for the working class impose the continuous development of housing and housing quality, an essential condition for the well-being of the entire nation. But comfort was thought of in a more profound manner. As the first sociological studies about dwellings started to appear, some general improvements were made. Better equipment for public space, one-person bedrooms, the mineral surface of the flats is suggested to be increased by 10%. The structure of the blocks is thought in some cases in a more flexible manner, one that allows for small adjustments in time. Also, the norms become a bit more flexible in the 70s. A great effort was made in the design institutes to generate even more building typologies as diverse as possible as an answer to different dwelling hypotheses, and which also comply to the design norms and standards, economical and building efficiency objectives. Due to the difference between the private and public dwellings, people started asking for more variety, and the political tried to answer. At the same time, the political appetite for centralization starts to grow, and an obsession to plan every aspect of existence starts to develop. After the 77, the seismic requirements become more strict, and massive demolition in the historic areas become consistent in some cities. From an urban point of view, the quality of the development is a bit worse, as the focus is placed on enclosement and generation of streets and boulevards, densification of existing neighborhoods, or more compact development. Urban policy also stated that in the urban area of the city, the height of buildings should be between 3 and 6 floors. This is another case study from Timișoara, the Circumvalațiuni neighborhood. At the end of the 70s, the city's largest neighborhood blocks were completed. Circumvalațiuni is one of them, but we also have Lipova, Radului, and Giroc. The initial logic of the Circumvalațiuni was directly related to the proximity to the industrial platform north of the railroad, taking advantage of the land available in the area. The aim was to achieve a compact and dense residential complex with social cultural facilities, green and recreational areas, playgrounds, and sports fields. The perception of a quiet area, the proximity to the workplace, and good accessibility to the city center and the shopping areas determine a great interest in the Circumvalațiuni area of those looking for a home of this type. In the 80s, since the objectives set in the previous decades were not met, the pressure on the fast development of housing was still a very relevant topic. At the same time, in this period, the boundaries of the cities were quite fixed. Hence, in this decade, we witnessed a massive densification process, either by adding construction to existing neighborhoods, framing streets and boulevards, by building on the remaining peripheric areas, or by replacing historical tissues. The development of a national style becomes a relevant topic again, and the great focus is put on the buildings facing boulevards, while the blocks behind them remain very plain. At the same time, a great effort is invested in the proper industrialization of housing production. Almost all buildings were fixed typologies made out of prefabricated panels. The regulation focused on the setting up of price limits for housing built on state funding, on the advanced deposits for private housing, and selling prices for housing from state stocks. To encourage housing developments in mid-sized and small towns, access to big cities was under tight control. In 87, loans were limited and no more loans were granted for building or buying houses in big cities and municipalities. Likewise, people could only own one house. For Timișoara, we looked at the Soarelui and the Girocului development, which following the industrial development of Calea Buziașului, the two ensembles were built on a large free plot between the industrial area and the city. They were designed in the form of a dwelling complex comprising blocks of flats, social cultural facilities of common use like creche, kindergarten, general school, dispensary, commercial units, and so forth. Green spaces, playgrounds and sports grounds, parking lots, and spaces inland road traffic. 4-story standardization buildings border the streets and delineate inner courtyards, which are either occupied with parking lots, garages, and other improvised building, or left free as green space. School and park are the main qualities appreciated by neighborhood residents and those living in neighboring neighborhoods. After the 90s and before the crisis, with but few exceptions, the architectural production during transition turns its back on the lessons learned before. In the 90s, there are many who chose detached housing. However, the trend of collective housing becomes noteworthy after the 2000s. Given a relatively flexible financial and legal environment ready to take risks, the early 2000s witnessed a building boom of wide range of extremes. Besides the wide range of buildings in great numbers, things were also pushed to extremes. Public investments in housing dwindled and the building industry started working on the principles of market economy. The latter made the appearance of the first real estate agents and early features of the real estate market possible. At the same time, people were allowed to build in towns, villages beyond the locality borders imposed by communist built-up areas. Private housing began to develop, while state built fewer and fewer housing developments because of public funded for such programs were cut. Rapid privatization measures were taken for state stock housing. According to budget acts, the funds thus obtained were supposed to be used only for various public work, housing developments being excluded. New rules for selling to tenants the housing from state stock were set up. National Housing Agency was set up to promote new housing projects, financed by public prescription, and the first rule for mortgage loan. Likewise, the rules of selling to tenants the housing from state stocks were established. With the lack of urban coherence and the increasing number of buildings, town will pile up significant malfunctions, such as absence of green spaces, of public parking lots, traffic congestion, disconnection to social and proximity services, higher density, and shadowing of buildings. For Timișoara, we look at the ring and the Banu construct. In general, the location and realization of real estate investments were guided more by the return of investment and less by the regulations stipulated by the city master plan, which were actually also often and easily derogated. The ring residential complex was built in successive stages, being the first residential compound built on an agricultural land located in the vicinity of the urban perimeter. It is adjacent to the Girdle Road, which is also the name of the ensemble. It offers a specific urban image in an area still in transition, with interventions of creating public spaces which are still unconnected with the street. After the crisis, the 2009 economic crisis offers a good opportunity to assess again the housing qualities on the one hand, for reasons appertaining to the financial constraints and precautions taken by investors, and on the other hand, because the dwellers raised their sides. Both the selective retrocession and clarification of judicial status of national urban houses and lands were intensified real estate transactions. The speedy development of public and private building sectors has been significantly assisted by government subsidies from state budgets through either the national program on assisting private housing or the savings and loaning program for housing or the first home program. Although they have grown into major financial tools for housing development, their impact on real estate market and housing sector is far from being significant. Except the first home program, which was a sort of lifesaver for the building market and loaning during the real estate crisis, its parameters, which contain in areas numbers of room and price, later led to a standardization of real estate products and excessive increase of two-room apartments of 52 square meters with a maximum price of 60,000 euros. Even if the current legislation offers a wide range of public housing, social housing, necessity housing, employee housing, support housing, housing for young people, and so forth, the amount of housing built out of public funds for the above mentioned categories are quite low, and in some towns they are hardly built. Despite ongoing real estate speculations, one can notice signs of maturity in the residential ensembles, which are more permeable, more open to the city, and tend to offer complementary functions to housing. For Timișoara, we have several residential development studies. In 2008-9, the real estate crisis led to a change in the economic behavior of both investors, home buyers, creditors, and guarantors. Post-crisis, a number of peripheral real estate projects have been abandoned, and investors and home buyers have shifted their interest to the available plots within the city. As a result of the economic restructuring process of the previous decade, many industrial areas or isolated industries within the urban tissue were demolished, and their place was taken by residential real estate investment and shopping malls. This phenomenon was completely cancelled, has not completely cancelled the tendency to build on cheap and poorly equipped public land on the outskirts of the city. About housing affordability. The easiest way of evaluating and comparing the affordability of apartments on a timescale is to relate the average take-home pay to the selling price of an apartment. In this case, the two-room one. Between the 50s and the 90s, the Romanian state would hold absolute control over building and selling of housing. Both the building and the selling price and the average rate of take-home pay were regulated so as to keep the price wave at its lowest. 53 to 42 take-home pays would stand for the price of a two-room apartment. Immediately after the 90s, the privatization boom of the state housing stock associated with overflowing inflation led to the situation in which, over a brief period of time, one could easily purchase such an apartment for two average take-home pays. At the same time, the 90s witnessed the emergence of real estate market, yet its impetus was somewhat blocked by poor cash flow and absence of lending tools. Consequently, that triggered the phenomenon of housing swaps. After the year 2000, the real estate prices started to grow due to the occurrence of the credit for real estate investments, and Romanians joined the European Union in 2004. This process was culminated in the real estate loop of 2007 and 2008 with a two-room apartment, when a two-room apartment could be bought for 281 take-home pays in Bucharest. Currently, a two-room apartment in Bucharest can be purchased by the price of 118 take-home pays, which is considerably smaller than the anti-real estate crisis in 2008. However, the price is currently and still growing. And here you can see the curve of the prices of the two-room flats. The one on the left is the one controlled by the state before the 90s. And the one on the right, you can see the free market economy and how the prices of the flats have grown. What I would also like to add here is that this chart is generated by looking at the median income per family. And I would also like to add that many of Romania's families do not even have that type of income. What about the future? I will give just two examples here, which come from very different perspectives. One is a network of pioneering housing cooperative. It's called the MOBA housing model. It brings together examples from the whole of Eastern Europe, from Belgrade, Ljubljana, Prague, Zagreb, and so forth. And the principle which they promote here is basically based on collective ownership. The cooperative buys land, deals with credit, and deals with the rules that make housing not a business but a fundamental right, as also the European legislation states. They are trying to do this since many years now. Also, financial models and credit systems have been implemented together with their organizational module. And what I would like to add to this is that also in Romania we have a law even from 2005 on the functioning and organization of cooperatives, which is completely unfunctional up to this point. These type of models where citizens are encouraged to build their housing in a model that is not speculative, I think is one of the ways in which this kind of problems can be solved. The other way is, of course, the way of the public policy. And this is an excerpt from an interview with Kurt Puchinger, the director of urban planning in Vienna. Vienna is, I think, probably the most extraordinary example in solving the housing problem. And what I would like to underline here is that they do this with basically three big tools. First of all, they use housing in order to develop their city in a coherent manner. So their program brings quality at the city level. This is something that we often forget to take into account, that public housing is not just solving a basic need, but it also solves a really collective need, and it has a straight line with the general quality of a city. The second one is the Vienna ticket for housing, and what I find really interesting here is that you can enter the system depending on your income, and they include here also middle income people, and they don't have a time limit when this ticket expires, which means that this program leads to a very cohesive social integration of different types of families and people, which also is, I think, very good on the long term. 60% of Viennese live in this housing system, half of them in state-owned buildings and the other half in buildings that are developed by cooperatives, as the program that I mentioned before. And of course, the third and really most powerful tool that they have is this special fund for housing, where they constantly concentrate on buying land and good quality projects in order to build up their stock and their building supply. Thank you very much. This was in short my presentation. My colleagues will make it available to anyone who wants to access it, and I can gladly answer your questions after the next presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was so interesting. And I think that we have a really good overview of what happened and how the housing situation changed. Personally, I'm very glad also of this ending with, from one hand, the cooperative way, which is private but taken in the hands of citizens, and on the other hand, how public housing can be developed. And Patricia is saying in the chat that we also have Susan Bauer here with us from Vienna, so maybe she can also allow some insights in the end of the presentation, and that would be excellent. We will move to the next presentation very soon, but I have just one question for you before we do that, if you don't mind. You were saying how the public housing was privatized and how the idea of collective housing with services was, let's say, disappearing, maybe coming back now with some of the new constructions. And I was wondering if politically your past as a communist country would block this somehow, because people maybe have some bad feelings about how the housing would be. So just what do you think in terms of mentality, if people would resist this kind of housing because of that?
Yes, of course, there is a certain fear that is, I think, quite specific for the former Eastern Bloc regarding actually ownership. And I think it's more about ownership and the capacity of people to own their home than about anything else. So I don't see any problems in having public policies on building public housing and organizing their from their built environment to their association with inhabitants. I think the most nevralgic point is the one of property, because we had a really great trauma with the whole demolishing processes that were happening in the communist regime, and I think that's the biggest wound. But I don't see why that should stop any other kinds of public policies regarding the state building and the ownership of homes.
Thank you so much. And we will get other questions. Everyone in the public, if you have any questions, you can always write them in the chat, and we will take on them in the end of the next presentation. I thank you again, and I give the word to Dubrovna to introduce our next speaker. And I already anticipate that the speaker will speak in Polish,